The first time I caught Karen trespassing on my property, she was knee-deep in my lake, sun hat perched on her head, holding a plastic wine glass like she owned the place. Her HOA friends were splashing around, laughing, and drinking as if this were a public resort instead of my privately owned land. I stood at the edge of my dock, arms crossed, watching as one of them set up a speaker blaring yacht rock. Karen finally noticed me and waved like we were old friends. "Oh hey Mark. Just thought we'd enjoy this gorgeous lake. You don't mind, right?" she called, completely ignoring the no trespassing sign behind her. I did mind. I minded a lot. I'd inherited this house and lake from my grandfather, who had spent his last years fishing in peace, away from people exactly like Karen. It was a piece of untouched paradise, surrounded by trees with clear water and a perfect little dock where I could sit with a beer and listen to the quiet. Except now, that quiet was shattered by Karen's personal summer party. "I do mind, actually," I said, stepping forward. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Karen scoffed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just water. You can't own a lake." I clenched my jaw. This wasn't the first time Karen had pulled something like this, but it was the first time she had been so blatant about it. She was the self-appointed queen of the nearby HOA, despite the fact that my property was not part of it. She had spent the past few weeks welcoming me to the neighborhood by trying to enforce HOA rules I wasn't bound to. I thought ignoring her would make her go away. Clearly I was wrong. "Actually, I can own a lake," I said, pulling out my phone. "And I do. Which means you're all trespassing. So you can either leave now or I'll call the police." The laughter died down. A few of her friends exchanged nervous glances. But Karen just let out a dramatic sigh as if I were the one being difficult. "Oh come on Mark. You can't seriously want to keep all this to yourself. Be reasonable." "I'm being very reasonable," I said, holding up my phone. "I'll give you 30 seconds to pack up your little pool party before I start dialing." Karen's face twitched, but she waved her hand dismissively. "Fine. But this isn't over." She led her posse out of the lake with the grace of a queen exiting a stage. They dripped water all over my dock as they gathered their things, grumbling under their breath. As they left, Karen shot me a look. "You'll regret this." I locked the gate that night. It was an old wrought iron thing, mostly decorative when my grandfather had installed it, but now I was making sure it had an actual purpose. I added a padlock and set up a couple of security cameras just in case Karen got any ideas. The next morning I woke up to shouting. I walked outside to find Karen and 2 other HOA members standing at the gate, shaking it like a bunch of raccoons trying to get into a trash bin. "Mark!" Karen shrieked. "Open this gate right now." I crossed my arms. "No." She stomped her foot. "This is illegal. You can't just lock the lake up." I raised an eyebrow. "Illegal? According to who?" Karen's face turned red. "You're being selfish. This lake has been here forever. The community has always used it." "That's funny because my grandfather owned this land for decades, and I don't remember any community access in his will." She turned to the other HOA members. "Are you hearing this? He's trying to cut us off from our lake." One of them, a tall guy with a receding hairline, cleared his throat. "Technically, if it's on his property, it's his." Karen whipped around to glare at him and he immediately looked at the ground. "So you're just going to let him steal from us?" "I'm not stealing anything," I said, leaning against the fence. "You're trespassing. And now you're harassing me." Her hands curled into fists. "If you don't open this gate, I will call the police." I smiled. "Go ahead." She blinked. I mean it." I pulled out my phone. "I'll even dial for you." She hesitated. I could see the gears turning in her head. If she called, the police would see that she was the one causing trouble. But she had come too far to back down now. With a huff, she snatched her own phone out of her purse and dialed. I stood there, arms crossed, as she spoke in her most dramatic voice. "Yes, hello. I'd like to report a man for illegally restricting access to a public lake." "Yes, that's right. He locked us out of our community space." "Oh, I see. Well, actually, yes, but..." Her voice faltered. She turned away slightly, muttering into the phone. After another few seconds, she hung up, her face twisted in frustration. "What happened?" I asked, grinning. "They're sending an officer," she snapped. "You'll see." I went back inside to make coffee, fully prepared to enjoy the show. 20 minutes later, a squad car pulled up and a bored-looking officer stepped out. Karen rushed to him, launching into a frantic explanation, gesturing wildly at the gate and at me like I was some kind of lake-hoarding villain. The officer listened patiently before turning to me. "Do you own this property?" "Yes, sir," I said, handing over the deed. He glanced at it, nodded and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, this is private land. He has every right to lock it." Karen's mouth flopped open. But he can't. It's a lake." The officer shrugged. "Doesn't matter. It's his." Her face turned beet red. "So you're saying he can just steal from the community?" The officer sighed. "Ma'am, if you continue trespassing you will be arrested." That shut her up. She let out a dramatic huff and crossed her arms. "Fine. But this isn't over." I watched her storm off, her HOA minions trailing behind like lost puppies. As the officer drove away, I couldn't help but smile. Oh, I knew this wasn't over. And I was more than ready for whatever Karen had planned next. I thought Karen had reached her peak level of insanity when she called the cops on me for locking my own gate, but I had severely underestimated her. The woman was relentless. If she couldn't barge in through the front, she was going to find every loophole, every dirty trick, and every ounce of bureaucratic nonsense to make my life as miserable as possible. The first wave of her revenge came in the form of complaints. It started with a letter taped to my door from the HOA, which was already hilarious considering I wasn't even part of their neighborhood. The letter, written in the most passive-aggressive tone imaginable, claimed that my property was in violation of community standards due to unsightly conditions. I stared at my perfectly maintained lawn, my clean driveway, and the freshly painted fence and wondered if Karen had finally lost her mind completely. The next morning, I woke up to an actual HOA inspector standing in my yard, clipboard in hand, looking around like he was searching for an excuse to find me. I stepped outside with my coffee and leaned against the porch railing, watching as he squinted at my fence like he had just spotted the eighth wonder of the world. "Morning," I said, taking a sip. "Can I help you?" He cleared his throat. Yes. We received reports of an unkempt property that violates HOA regulations." I blinked. "I'm not in the HOA." He hesitated, flipping through his papers. "Well, technically your property is adjacent to the HOA community, and therefore subject to some shared community standards." I let out a short laugh. "Yeah, no. That's not how property ownership works." He looked uncomfortable but still tried to hold his ground. "Well, we still need to conduct an inspection." I smiled. "Great. I'll call the cops for trespassing while you do that." He didn't even argue. He just muttered something about checking with the board, and hurried back to his car, speeding off like he had just narrowly escaped a hostage situation. I knew exactly who was behind it, but I also knew that this was just the beginning. The next tactic Karen used was filing noise complaints. At first, I thought it was a coincidence when a police officer knocked on my door and asked if I had been hosting late-night parties. I told him the only sound coming from my house at night was me watching reruns of old sitcoms. He chuckled, apologized, and left. But when it happened again the next night, then again 2 days later, I knew what was going on. Karen was spamming the police with false reports, hoping they would eventually get annoyed enough to do something. The best part? Every time an officer showed up, I was either reading a book, working on my computer, or one time literally taking a nap. The sheer absurdity of it was almost impressive. After the fourth visit from the police, I decided to return the favor. I installed floodlights in my backyard, pointed directly at Karen's house. Every night at exactly 10 o'clock they switched on, illuminating her entire backyard like a stadium during a championship game. She complained, of course, but there was nothing she could do. I wasn't violating any noise ordinances, and technically the lights were on my property. That's when Karen escalated. One evening I came home to find a letter in my mailbox from a lawyer. Apparently, Karen had filed a lawsuit claiming that the lake was public property, and that I had illegally restricted access to it. She had even gathered a few signatures from HOA members who supported her delusion. I laughed out loud reading it. Not because lawsuits weren't serious, but because the sheer stupidity of this one made it impossible to take seriously. It was like someone suing a grocery store because they didn't like the way the apples were stacked. Instead of panicking, I called a lawyer friend of mine. He took one look at the letter and nearly choked on his coffee. "Oh, this is nonsense," he said. "They don't have a legal leg to stand on." I told him to go ahead and draft a response, which essentially said in the politest legal terms possible, "Nice try, but you're an idiot." That should have been the end of it, but Karen, in all her wisdom, decided to double down. The next weekend, I caught a contractor standing outside my fence, holding a clipboard and looking confused. I walked over and asked if he needed help, and that's when he told me he had been hired to remove the gate blocking the lake. By who? Karen. She had actually hired a guy to come onto my property and tear down my fence like she was some kind of HOA warlord reclaiming land. The contractor, to his credit, looked uncomfortable when I explained the situation. "She told me it was an HOA issue," he admitted. "I don't want to get involved in anything illegal." I assured him he had nothing to worry about and suggested he send Karen the bill for wasting his time. He laughed, packed up his stuff and left. That night, my security cameras caught Karen trying to break my padlock with a pair of bolt cutters. She had finally snapped. Watching the footage, I had to give her credit. Most entitled people knew when to stop. Most would cut their losses, maybe grumble about how unfair life was and move on. But not Karen. She had doubled, tripled, and now quadrupled down on the most insane plan imaginable, all because she couldn't handle the fact that she wasn't entitled to something. I could have called the police right then and there, but I had a better idea. I waited. I let her think she had gotten away with it. I even let her and her little HOA minions sneak onto my property the next day to celebrate. I wanted her to feel like she had won. Because when I struck back, I wanted it to be the most humiliating, public, and legally devastating moment of her entire life. The moment I saw Karen on my security footage, crouched down like some suburban ninja trying to cut through my padlock, I knew I had her exactly where I wanted. I could have called the police right then and there, but that would have been too easy. She had spent weeks tormenting me, filing bogus complaints, trying to sue me, and even hiring a contractor to destroy my fence. If she wanted a war, I was going to give her one. On my terms. The first step of my plan was letting her think she had won. The next morning, I purposely left the gate unlocked and watched from my house as Karen and her little HOA minions strutted onto my property like they had just claimed new territory. They dragged in lawn chairs, coolers, even a giant inflatable swan. Karen was in full queen of the HOA mode, barking orders and directing people where to set up. I sat back and let them have their fun. Then I made my move. I had already spoken to my lawyer, who had confirmed that I had more than enough evidence to charge Karen with trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. But that wasn't enough. Karen needed to be humiliated. She needed to be put in her place so thoroughly that she would never think about pulling something like this again. So I put up a sign in my front yard that read, "Private property, now HOA free. Lake access closed to all trespassers. HOA President Karen can explain why." Then for the cherry on top, I posted the security footage of Karen cutting my lock onto the local neighborhood Facebook page. It spread like wildfire. The comments were everything I hoped for. People who had been terrorized by Karen for years suddenly had the receipts they needed to call her out. Some HOA members who had blindly supported her were now backtracking, claiming they had no idea she had gone to such extremes. And the best part? The HOA board called an emergency meeting to discuss her behavior. Karen, of course, was furious. She stormed over to my house later that evening, face red with rage, her phone clutched in her hand. "You take that post down right now," she screamed before she even made it to my front door. I leaned against the doorframe, sipping my coffee. "Why? Is it not accurate?" She jabbed her finger at me. "You're making me look bad." I grinned. "No, Karen. You did that all on your own." She let out a noise that was somewhere between a growl and a scream. "This is defamation." I shrugged. "Pretty sure defamation requires me to lie about you. But everything in that video is real, isn't it?" She spluttered, clearly searching for a way to twist the situation in her favor. "You don't understand. I was trying to do what's best for the community. You can't just hoard the lake." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean my private lake?" Her hands curled into fists. "This isn't over." I smiled. "Actually, I think it is." Because right at that moment, a police car pulled up in my driveway. Karen whirled around, her face paling. You called the cops on me?" I tilted my head. "You mean like you did to me? Multiple times? Over nothing?" The officer stepped out, looking directly at Karen. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you about an ongoing trespassing and vandalism complaint." She turned back to me, eyes wide. "You wouldn't." I gave her a little wave. Karen tried everything. She tried to argue, she tried to lie, she even tried to cry. But the footage didn't lie. The evidence was stacked against her, and the officer was already well aware of how much of a nuisance she had been. As she was being escorted to the squad car, she turned back to me one last time. "This is harassment. You'll regret this." I gave her the biggest grin I could muster. "No, Karen. I think you're the one with regrets." With Karen out of the picture, the HOA crumbled. Without their fearless leader, the other board members started resigning one by one. It turned out Karen had been using HOA funds to fuel her little vendettas, and when that came to light, the whole thing collapsed. The best part? The lake remained mine and no one dared to trespass again. I finally got my peace and quiet. And every time I sat on my dock, fishing rod in hand, listening to the calm lapping of the water, I smiled, knowing that I had outplayed the queen of the HOA at her own game. If you enjoyed this wild roller coaster of entitlement, drama, and well-earned revenge, make sure to subscribe for more epic stories just like this. Your support keeps these insane tales coming, and trust me, there's plenty more where that came from. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and don't forget to drop a comment. Have you ever dealt with a Karen like this? Let's hear your best or worst horror stories below.